is Nancy Zentis, and I'm the founder of the Institute of Organization Development. We provide online certification programs. And we are very pleased today to sponsor this webinar by Dr. Mary Lippitt. She's a well-known professional in the field of organization development. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about her before she gets started. Dr. Lippitt is an internationally recognized leader in strategic thinking, change execution, and leadership effectiveness. In addition to writing an award-winning book, Brilliant or Blunder, 6 Ways Leaders Navigate Uncertainty, Opportunity, and Complexity, Mary also teaches in the MBA program at the University of South Florida. Mary founded Enterprise Management Limited 30 years ago with a clear focus on helping leaders develop smarter results. She developed the Leadership Spectrum Profile as offering a new leadership lens targeting outcomes. It was awarded one of the top 10 training products by Human Resource Management magazine. And it's with my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Mary Lippitt.
Thank you so much, Nancy, and thanks to you and the Institute of OD for sponsoring this webinar. What our topic is today is about leadership reality. We are living in the age of reality. We have reality TV, we have augmented reality with Google Glass, and now we have virtual reality. So I think it's time that we also take a look at leadership reality. So my goals today is to learn first a practical leadership lens to realistically develop leadership effectiveness in delivering results, and also to recognize how mindset mastery adds a practical dimension for leadership development. So let me just suggest to you that we sort of step back from the way we normally look at leadership, and we actually ask the question, what gets leaders on the cover of business magazines? What is it that they use to actually put someone on the cover? And what I would suggest is that the most admired leaders that make the cover of business magazines, and I'm just using Fortune here, but there's certainly a slew of business magazines, you know, things like innovation, vision, business models being unique. Of course, that was one of the things about Amazon. Growth, service, structure, such as Zappos coming up with a new structure, profits, quality, safety, and culture. But at the same time, what I'd like to have you think about is that when you either coach or do training or you think about developing your own leadership, what are the questions that you normally ask yourself? And what are the questions that normally come up is, what are the characteristics of an outstanding leader? Or what is the style of an outstanding leader? Or what are the competencies of an outstanding leader? And then also, what are the achievements? And it's interesting, by the question that we ask, what happens is that channels our answers more than we might recognize. So if we're looking specifically at the characteristics, we have a list of self-awareness and honesty, courage, resilience, engaging, and that's a very different list. And yes, we should be focusing on these in developing our leaders, but we have to understand this is just one list for developing leadership effectiveness. The second list is one that was developed about the 1940s, and we still feel very comfortable using. It's a Myers-Briggs or the DISC, or a variety of tools that look at leadership style. And some of the recent ones around servant leadership and emotional intelligence, it's still, again, a very valid way of looking at leadership. About the 1980s, what we did was we started looking at leadership competencies. So what we had was basically a switch. Under characteristics and style, we were looking at who the leader was. Under competencies, excuse me, what we started to look at were how well they knew to do their job. So we started training people in a variety of skills, and these are some people call these knowledge, skills, and abilities, or competencies. But again, a very different list than the style or the characteristics. And obviously the last question is, what are the achievements? of a great leader, what we have is, again, a very different list. And what I would like to just offer to you is that we need to recognize these distinctions in the way we approach leadership so that we make sure that we really develop the well-rounded, complete leader. So what I would propose to you is that we look at leadership in 4 different quadrants, starting from the upper left. Character and personal mastery was the first. Moving to the right, style and how we interact was our second. Understanding of an interesting and essential component of leadership. Then we moved to this competencies, the skills and expertise. And what I'd like to talk about in this webinar today is to take a look at the 4th and what I think still a very critical but overlooked area of looking at the leaders' abilities to actually choose what to do given the current circumstances or context, the realities they're facing. So let me just go back and just reiterate what I'm talking about is something very different than what has happened in the past. We used to talk about leadership in terms of charisma or being seen as somebody that people want to work with. And I'm just going to cite Peter Drucker as suggesting that leadership is not about making speeches or being liked. It's defined by results. And to go to a non-leadership guru in terms of Yoda, it's what they do, not what they try to do that counts. So let me just get to an interesting question for you. And you don't have to chat on this one, but just answer this question to yourself, if you would, please. How do you pronounce the capital of Kentucky? Is it Louisville, Louisville, or Louisville? I'll give you half a second here just to think about which one you would choose. Now, I'm just going to ask this question of you. How many of you decided that the capital of Kentucky is Frankfurt? What we have here is an assumption in the question that we did not test. Now, again, you can also suggest that I was sort of misleading you on, and I was at fault for your coming up with the wrong answer. But it does point to the fact that sometimes when we're presented with a reality, we actually have to check out what the assumption is behind that reality. So what I would like to suggest to you is that we start thinking about leadership in 2 different ways. And I'll mention that the book by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, actually does a wonderful job. By the way, he's a Nobel laureate, wonderful research. And what he was suggesting is that in the past, leaders have been the hares. They have to think very fast. They're actually judged by how quickly they can come up with an answer. They're supposed to be able to answer almost any question. And what he's suggesting is that there's another mode for leadership, which is thinking slow. And he brings this up because what he's suggesting, and something I agree with, is that we're facing more complexity, more systems integration issues, more unprecedented situations, very novel realities, cross-functional situations, and ambiguous data. So we have conflicting data, so we just can't rely on making a fast decision. If it's a known quantity with known restraints and known risks, sure, you can jump to the fast decision. But he's suggesting that more and more what we're facing with are greater challenges in our decision making. And I'm going to suggest that his work has been recently supported when the World Economic Forum produced their report on the future of jobs. And what they found was that the 10 jobs, skills, and competencies and abilities and effectiveness that are needed by the year 2020 is a very different list than what they had for the year 2015. And if you'll take a look at this list, what you'll see at the top is complex problem solving, which is a thinking skill. Critical thinking, obviously. Creativity is also a thinking skill. What we also have is judgment and decision making, which is a thinking kind of capacity, as well as cognitive flexibility, the mental agility. So we have 5 out of the 10 skills needed in 2020 deal with an individual's ability to analyze, to accept data, to weigh options, to make the smart decision. And in addition, and I have to apologize, this slide is not as, I couldn't fit everything on the slide, so what I will say is that the number one increasing skill set that people are looking at with the 52% is actually cognitive abilities. So the question comes up then, what can we do about it? What is it that we can help individuals understand, and is it something that we can train? And yes, we can. We can develop it either in coaching sessions, in staff meetings. We can help people enhance their cognitive skills. And what I would just again point out that most of the time when we're looking at leadership, we have left out the reality of the statistics of how effective they were. So here's a picture of a baseball game where the pitcher has the intention of pitching a shutout. And again, intention's good. We want them to be motivated. But the end result is also important. And so this concept of merging results orientation with some of the existing ways we look at leadership, I think makes a great deal of sense today. So what I'm going to be proposing is that we take a leadership thinking lens to take a look at and say that in addition to having, the great self-awareness and the ability to interact with others and, how to do the job, leaders must know what to do. And to do that, they must collect information from a variety of sources that identify and critically assess what the alternatives are. We can't just jump and do the same thing over and over again and then adjust to new realities for sustainable results. And let me just ask you to reflect. Have you ever had an aha moment where you were thinking one thing and then someone else spoke to you and you actually had a different understanding as a result of how they saw things? I have had many of these. And I would just like to suggest to you that as things are getting more complex and as the world is challenging us more and more, whether it's competition, whether it's technology, or whatever we're dealing with, what we really need to do is to start understanding that different points of view are valid. So I'm going to ask you, what do you see in this slide? Now, if you answer now, my guess is you're going to answer horse. If you answered at this point, you'd be saying frog. And this is one of the new realities, that sometimes both views are right. It literally depends on your point of view. So I'm going to suggest that it's now important to scan inside the organization as well as outside the organization for multiple viewpoints, which I'm going to call mindsets. And again, these viewpoints or mindsets change based on current reality. A lot of our leadership models are based on something that's basically stable, like our characteristics and sometimes our style. Our competencies really grow slowly. But what I'm suggesting is that this new focus on leadership thinking is what's going to enable leaders to be agile, to adjust to the changes. Yes, I need to be consistent, but I also need to be flexible. And that's an interesting dichotomy to balance. But again, the more we communicate about mindsets, the more people can accept that. So why use a mindset? And I mentioned just now the change, the complexity, the ambiguous data, the fact that systems are involved. And I think many of us are aware that psychologists have said that most of us can remember only things at the same time. Some people only 5, some people 9. But the reality today is that there's so many more factors at play that we really need a system, a structure, a technique to bring all that information together and evaluate it. Risks are increasing. Sometimes a bad decision could be not only career-ending, but threaten the actual organizational survival. Another issue that we have, and we need to be a little bit more cognizant of slow mindset thinking, is that there are multiple audiences. There's the external customers, there are internal customers, there are stakeholders, there's a board. There's so many different people that we have to speak with. In addition, our resources are limited. We can't do everything we want to do because, again, we have some constrained resources. And there's a need to see what's coming next. So we have to prepare, and when it's just a trend, so we're prepared when that trend materializes. And as we all know, if we're planning change, it takes a long time. You can't just snap your fingers, announce a new proposal, and expect everyone to jump on board quickly. Another part of this process of focusing on thinking for leadership is that leaders can leverage patterns that are developing and also identify new alternatives. So this is suggesting that we really need to be cognizant of the context, the circumstances, and this aspect, this lens for leadership lets us do that. Now, some people say, okay, I don't want to adapt to change. And what I would like you to notice in the picture on this slide is that, if we run our organizations by just looking in the rearview mirror, we're not going to be prepared for survival. So the comment is, if you keep doing what you've always done, you'll get the results you've always gotten. And my assumption is that will not be enough. So we really have to balance where to be consistent and where to adapt. So what I'm going to suggest is this slow thinking or mindset lens approach to leadership is going to be very helpful for scanning for current information, again, before jumping to the conclusion, for those situations that require slow thinking. Not everything does. I used to give an example that if I offered you $100,000, you wouldn't need to think too long before saying yes. But there are other situations where you really need to step back and do a full analysis. The second part of a mindset lens is that you're going to be focusing on reality and rather than just relying on habit. This knee-jerk responses are not going to be as accurate. And the mindset lens helps us understand what's stable, what's changing, and then again, what patterns are developing. So at the point of my presentation about the mindset lens is to suggest to you that this is very easy to adapt. This is not going to require a mental transplant, a mind transplant, or it's not going to require you to change your style. What's going to be asked of you is to take a look at 6 areas or buckets, mindsets, where you want to collect information. And this example right here, it is an example at the strategic level. So the inventing mindset says, what can we do to be a state-of-the-art company? How can we be seen as an industry leader? How can we tweak our existing products and offer something new, but it's just basically a product extension? What can we do internally to become more interactive, more able to tap the thinking? Again, a lot of the cross-functional work in organizations is taking a look at these internal synergies to be more efficient. A lot of the mergers that take place are based on the assumption that internal synergies will pay off. And if I had to come up with a company that has adopted them and focused on the inventing, of course you'd come up with something like Apple or Amazon that actually broke the mold and came up with something new. The second mindset is taking a look at the customers externally. Who are my competitors? What are the customers that I'm serving? Am I serving them well? Can I respond quickly to customer complaints? What am I doing to grow the market share? And so this is a different focal point. It's not an innovation and creativity, and it's basically on the market. And right now, in the healthcare world, we're seeing a lot of mergers because they're basically saying we want to grow the market fast. We have some new standards for customer satisfaction. And there's this feeling that we have to operate quickly, whether it's dealing with the electronic medical records or whatever else. So that's catalyzing that fast movement with an external perspective is the second mindset. We'll take a look at the questions that need to be asked there. Under the developing mindset, what we're looking at is how are we going to be structured? Matrix, regional, product line, how are we going to create seamlessness between those different functions once we get them started? What are our policies going to be? What are the ways that we can work together to deliver consistent performance? And again, maybe an example of this might be a Zappos, where they basically have their customer service people sitting in with some of the engineers and design people, the operations people. Again, a design for seamless operations. The performing mindset is taking a look at how can, after we've established our policies and our procedures, how can we improve on them? What can we do to enhance quality? A lot of the Six Sigma lean kinds of efforts are in this arena. What's our return on investment? It's an interesting question. Many of the organizations are asking, you know, what is our ROI from leadership development and succession planning? And this mindset is a valid one. And again, one of the companies that you might want to say highlights the performing mindset is Walmart. Very efficient, very interested in the process improvement. The fifth mindset takes a look at how we internally work. How can we retain the key talent? How can we develop competencies for the future? What is our culture going to be like? Do we have succession planning? Are we training people effectively? And what I would suggest to you is that of the companies that are going after, you know, the outstanding workplace companies are ones that are focusing at this point in time because they see this area of excellence to be an area where they would help them attract people as well as maintain their successful history so far and extend it into the future. The last mindset takes a look at how do we capture emerging opportunities, how do we test assumptions. Remember the question I gave you about the capital of Kentucky? You made the assumption that my answers matched my question. And again, I did purposely mislead you, but it points out the fact that sometimes we need to test the assumptions. How are we going to be positioned for the future? What are the new business models that we could use? What are the new areas that we could even think about going after? And an example of this mindset is Elon Musk, who came up with the Tesla, the SpaceX, the Solar City. Again, very conceptually, he actually came up with an idea about transportation in California. He said, it's a great idea, but I don't have the capacity to follow through with it. So he actually gave the idea away for someone else to develop. Now, I will admit that all the examples I've used have been at the strategic level, but these 6 buckets or mindsets also operate at every level of the organization. And let me just make it a very personal example. If you were going to purchase a new car right now, what information would you want to consider? What aspect would be the most critical in your selection? Now, I know that the first answer is what's going to cost me. But sometimes people don't look just at cost. They might look at things like, what do I have to pay per month? So taking the same 6 buckets, what we could say in the inventing bucket is, what are the new features that this car has? Does it have a backup mirror? Does it have automatic braking? Is it as stylish as I want it to be? A lot of people rejected some models in the past because they were too boxy. So that's one area that you want to consider if you're going to buy a car. And then the next area, the catalyzing area, what is the level of customer service that I'm going to get when I buy the car? You know, is it going to really meet my needs? Am I going to get a loaner car or not? What is going to be the cycle time? How long will I have to wait? That's a different area of questions, but still a very valid one. The next mindset would say, is there a dealer or service facility nearby? Now, I have to admit, when I bought a car in the 1980s, I overlooked this question. And what I bought was a lovely, stylish full-featured car that was called a Peugeot, and it was made and manufactured in France. And I had a fender bender, and I didn't know that we had to send to France to get those parts, and it made a big difference that we basically took a long time to repair that car. It's now a question that I'm sure that I ask. Under the performing mindset, we might ask, what's the overall cost to operate? What's the miles per gallon? Will this be a very expensive car to insure or not? I mean, these are all very oriented to some very easy data, but some very important data. Under the protecting mindset is, what is the warranty like? By the way, is it really a safe car? Will it handle front-end side collisions that they're now looking at? The last question here, will it fit? I had a neighbor who bought a car and brought it home and found out that it wouldn't fit in his garage. So again, some interesting questions that might not pop to the surface immediately, but hopefully when you make your decision, you'll collect this information. Not that all of these have to be equal. You're going to probably need to choose one or two that become primary for you. The last question is the challenging question, which says, as I look to the future, will it meet my needs in 4 years? Would it be better for me to purchase, or should I lease this car? Which is the better option? So again, these mindsets give you the questions to ask to make sure that you're accepting and being able to collect all the information you need for a complicated or complex decision. So I'm going to ask you a question. Again, the power of questions is it does trigger our thinking. What do you think can be done to improve the revenue for selling watermelons? Now, I'm going to wait and see if anybody has an idea for just a couple of seconds here. Does anything pop to anybody's mind? Nothing yet. Well, I will go ahead and share with you an answer that I found when I was in Japan. I never knew that you could grow watermelons in a glass box and make them all uniform and square. First of all, they don't roll when you ship, so you don't have the damage. They actually fit better in most refrigerators. And it's, again, something I would never have considered to have a square watermelon. And it comes up because people ask the question. So the issue here is the value of asking the questions. It actually stirs our thinking, and we can develop some new alternatives. And what I'm going to suggest is this mindset lens helps us stay agile, making sure that we read the situation and investigate all the alternatives before we evaluate options. Now, I underlined the word all on purpose because what happens most of the time is that people recognize one alternative and then maybe have another one. But usually that second alternative is a straw alternative. It really isn't something you would ever really select. So you say you have two alternatives, but you really only have one that's viable. And one of the real interesting issues is to ask people to come up with more than two alternatives, because it does really stir some thinking and seeing some new perspectives, some new points of view that you can at least then evaluate and see if they would make sense for you. And the reason for the picture of the person in tennis is to remind us that, that staying on your toes and being agile is making sure that you're ready for the next shot. And I still think that there's a parallel here with leaders who have to stay agile and be ready for the next change, because it is coming so very quickly. So what I'm suggesting is that you ask questions and you get all this information in. And then the question will be, I've got all these different things to consider, but, which one should I focus on now? And this is what we're going to be calling a mindset priority. You have to first look at all six, but you can't do six things simultaneously. Not only can you not do them, but frequently we don't have the resources to do them simultaneously. So what we're having to do is select what is the best choice given our current reality. What are the results that I want to make sure are achieved first, given our current context, current situation, circumstances? What is the best goal that we should be focusing on right now? And it might be the goal that will lead us to a secondary goal and then a third goal, but the point is we need to focus something first. Some people talk about the long pole and the tent being the center one. We establish that first, and then we can, build around it. A priority is also what we decide is the first thing that we need to get accomplished. It's what we're going to do to leverage the new realities or to address the critical issues. But basically, it's saying what we need to do is focusing on what's most important. And let me just give you an example. I mean, if I this weekend want to go see a play, I paid some money, I want to sit in the theater. If that theater catches fire, I'm not going to sit there. I'm going to leave. Why? The reality changed. And by the way, almost everybody else will be leaving too. It isn't going to be a matter of only the extroverts leave or only the people who know about fire safety leave. It's basically saying our choices are based on what we're reading right now and what we consider to be the most important thing for us to do right now. We all have too much on our plate. We all need to set priorities. One of the time management tools that we used to have was a to-do list. And they used to say, rate those to-dos as A, B, or C. A were the important ones, B, okay. And they said C were the ones that you were supposed to delegate to others. We actually spend a lot of time setting priorities, but we don't actually refer to it in the same way that I'm asking you to think about it right now. And what I'm going to suggest to you is that it's important to get those priorities right. So let me share a couple of individuals in large companies that you are probably familiar with who got it wrong. So one example was a CEO at McDonald's who said, we tried to get bigger, which was that growth, that catalyzing mindset, when we should have gotten better, which was that performing mindset. And that was a mistake, because what they realized when they got better and people perceived the quality and the cleanliness of their restaurants, then of course their market share grew. So what was the question? What do we need to do first? He got it wrong. Here's another example of a CEO who got something wrong. Ron Johnson was hired from a very successful track record of establishing the Apple stores, and he was asked to come in and take over JCPenney and to rebrand it and to bring it back into a successful organization. And so what he decided to do was to drop anything about coupon and sales and just say, let's just give everybody a flat, great price. And I think you're aware of the fact, you probably tell by the fact his tenure was short, it didn't work. And he has been let go and replaced. And one of the most recent examples are the individuals at Volkswagen. They made a decision that they were trying to increase their emissions so they would position themselves in the market and people would want to buy them because they were so efficient in terms of air pollution. And what they did is they made a choice to alter the software so that when the emissions were being tested, the emissions would look different than when the emissions were actually on the road. And so the current CEO of Volkswagen Group is saying that the most urgent task for them right now is to regain the trust that people had in Volkswagen, because they've had quite a significant downturn in sales. But he's not going to focus on sales right now. He recognizes the most important thing to do is to rebuild the trust. So what I would like to suggest to you is that there's a need for alertness. Now, some people will say, no, consistency counts. You got to be consistent, because then when people will feel comfortable with you, they'll know what to expect. But what I'm going to say is that consistency has a downside too. And I'm quoting Mark Twain here to suggest that even if you're on the right track, you'll get run over if you just stay there. We can't just hold on to the past. And we've had some mature companies who recognize that they have to reposition themselves. IBM is one example that comes to mind. So let me just give you another exercise. I'm going to ask you to take a look at the left diagram where there is a black box, a white star with a dot in the middle. I'm going to ask you to take a look at that for about 15 seconds. Would you just please focus on that diagram? Now, would you shift your focus to the other dot? How many of you, we don't have an opportunity to chat that well, but most of you, I think, will recognize that when you looked at the right-hand diagram, the black shadow of the star came with it. And I'm asking you to do this exercise as an example of the fact that we carry with us so much in terms of our past experience, our past ways of seeing things, but we're not always aware of really how much we're carrying with us. And unless we sit back and for those complex decisions, those complex, challenging realities, the unprecedented ones, the ones where there's not clear data, we have to be able to ask the questions. So I was talking earlier about how thinking in 2020 was going to be the most critical skill, number one. What I'll just mention to you is that when Tom Watson Sr. founded IBM quite a few years ago, what he said was that what every business needs is more people who can think. And he actually had a sign that said think on his desk. So when you went in to see him, he had a big sign in front of you saying think. And the question comes up, how many people have been really outstanding thinkers? I'm going to suggest to you that the steps for thinking are pretty clear. I use the words deep to stand for detection. There's a step one, exploration is step two, evaluation is step three, and planning is step four. So I can understand, we can talk about the steps of thinking, but the reality is under detection, exploration, evaluation, and planning, I still need to check where my reality is, because otherwise I'll do what you did with the exercises with the dots and the star. We'll just continue to do what we've always done. And that is not just us today. Dr. Paul Nutt wrote a book, Why Decisions Fail. And in his research, he found that 80% of the decisions made by executives were made without ever considering alternative. And that most of them, about 50%, failed. So there's a real need to start taking a look at leadership thinking as an additional area for development. So what I would suggest to you is that mindset thinking considers all the time frames. And again, what happens in a lot of situations, we look at the past and the present, we don't always project out into the future. One of the criticisms of Wall Street is, there's short time windows. And mindset thinking says we have to think longer. Mindset thinking also promotes more of a strategic analysis. And by strategic, I don't mean 10 years out. I'm just saying I'm looking at the opportunities as well as the risks. I'm not just going to be enamored by what could be. I'm going to check out how likely it is to be. It isn't just what's possible, it's what's feasible. Mindset thinking also encourages creativity. One of the reasons I gave you the watermelon activity. It's going to focus on results, and that's how a lot of people get measured, not just the baseball players, but also leadership that makes the covers of magazines, but also make sure that you have a long-term success. It will also value collaboration, and it's easy for people to learn and apply. And I think that last one is the one that might cause some people to say, how easy is it to learn to think? And the reality is it's very easy because it's not dependent on your IQ. What we're really suggesting is for each mindset, there is a series of questions to be asked. And the leader's role is to be able to ask those questions. It isn't necessary to provide the answer, to make sure that everything has been considered. So how can we leverage technology is another question for the inventing mindset. What is competition doing as a catalyzing mindset? Are we learning from and retaining our key customers is another question. And to move on to the developing mindset, what will create seamless performance? Performing mindset, what's the cost-benefit analysis? For the protecting mindset, do we have the skills and staff that we need? The challenging mindset, what are emerging customer trends that need to be addressed? How can alliances or partnerships help us? Can we get some new distributors that we hadn't thought of? So what we're suggesting is that we need to ask all these questions, and then we need to set the priorities. So I'm suggesting a leadership mindset frame of reference for leaders is not an IQ or trait, and it's not a style, and it's not a competency. It's a decision to ask the questions and understand all points of view to leverage the current circumstances. So it's a very different approach to leadership that says, I don't have to be the answer machine. I have to be the person that generates the questions. What it suggests also is that there's some interesting patterns within these mindsets. The challenging, inventing, catalyzing, the ones on the left, have some things in common. What they have in common is a belief that fast change is absolutely great, that risk is necessary if we're going to get reward, and that we should look primarily externally to see what's going on. And the mindsets on the right, the developing, the performing, and the protecting mindsets, say let's look at how we should manage change slowly. Let's do it with lots of thought, lots of care, and lots of modification to make sure it gets implemented. Let's find ways to reduce risk and take a look mostly internally. And I don't think it would surprise you to learn that the mindsets on the left, the catalyzing, inventing, challenging, are the ones that come up with lots of new change initiatives. And we know that the success rate for change initiatives is basically the highest. Some people say 8%, some people say 11%, some people will say 30%. But if you have a 70% or more chance of failure, you've got to look at what's happening. And sometimes the mindsets on the left don't value the mindsets on the right, and they start calling those people resistors. And what we can do is when we listen to people, these are the people on the right, the developing, performing, and protecting mindsets, are the mindsets that will ensure that what we want to get done actually gets implemented. So what we're saying is that take all that information in and then make a choice. This depiction suggests the challenging and inventing turned out to be the priorities that they were going to follow. But it could just as likely be another 2 or another 1. But what we need to do is to make sure that we collect the information first before we jump to a conclusion, because those conclusions sometimes we're overlooking things. So one more exercise for you. I'd like you to read this to yourself. What's in the triangle, please? How many of you read it as a bird in the hand is better than 2 in the bush? And my guess is that some of you looked at it, recognized, didn't bother looking at some of the little details that the word the has been duplicated, because it was familiar to us. We just jumped to a conclusion. And again, in many instances, that works well. For those instances where we're dealing with change, we better look at some of the details. So what I'm going to suggest to you is if we change the way we see things, the things we see will change. So if you look at the slide, you can look at the black dots, or you could also see the white square within the black dots. Both of those are accurate. Both of those provide a better picture than just choosing one or the other. And what this actually goes back to is something that I'm sure you all are familiar with, the story of the 6 blind men and the elephant. And the assumption was that the person at the tail said the elephant was a rope. The person feeling the trunk said the elephant was a column. The person feeling the side said the elephant was a wall. The person feeling the trunk said it was a snake. The person feeling the tusk said it was a spear. What we basically have to understand is that although this is 6 blind men, in our world today, there's so many things to see and so many things to assert and collect information on before we jump to the conclusion of not only what an elephant is, but also what we should be doing first. What I would just offer you that the mindset is a tool that provides a checklist, and that checklist, by the way, is not something that should be seen as limiting the capacity of leaders. Doctors use checklists. There's a book called The Checklist Manifesto, How to Get Things Right. It's been very influential in reducing hospital errors. We have physicians that use checklists. We have lawyers that use checklists. And we have pilots who use checklists. It's just saying I don't want to overlook something. I don't want to read a bird in the hand when the actual material said a bird in the hand. So it's just a reminder to check and see if something has actually changed. So what I would like to offer to you is to suggest that leadership in the 21st century is going to be a little different than in the past. What it's going to be now is people need to be able to say, I liked what we did, I liked what we accomplished, the results, the outcome. I liked how we did it, I liked how we used our skills and competencies, and I liked how I was treated as a person. So those are the skills, those are the styles and the characteristics of the last. The middle one is about the competencies, and the top one about what takes a look at this thinking lens for leadership. And we need all three. You can't have one without the others to be successful. But from my experience, we've been focusing on the second and third, and we haven't been giving as much attention as needs to be given to the first. So I have been talking for quite a while, and I apologize for that, but what I'd like to do is thank you for participating and make two offers to you. First, we do have the Leadership Spectrum Profile, as Nancy suggested in the introduction, and if you want to email me, I'll give you a free online access so you can take the Leadership Spectrum online and print out your report. Now, the Leadership Spectrum asks you to take one situation at one point in time. It's not doing an assessment of how you lead in every situation. It's asking what new project are you working on, what are tasks are you dealing with, that you want to focus on, and use that as the frame of reference for answering all the questions in the Leadership Spectrum Profile. So Leadership Spectrum Profile does not provide a label because it's going to say what your priority was for that project, knowing that when circumstances change, that will change. So I might be using one mindset for one project and another mindset for another project. And then also, if you would like to register for a May 19th webinar, I can send you that information when you email me to take the Leadership Spectrum Profile, and that actually will be a debrief of the report that you can print out as soon as you finish taking the Leadership Spectrum Profile. So what I'd like to do now is to thank you again for your time and to see what questions you might be able to ask. What did I not explain well? What answers might I be able to provide? So please feel free to send a chat if you'd like.
Yes, Mary, thank you very much. This is Dr. Nancy Zenas again, and if you look in your control panel, you'll see a section that says questions. So if you could quickly type your questions in there, we will then ask Mary, and she will respond to any questions that you might have. In the meantime, what a great offer, Mary, to get a free a leadership spectrum assessment. That's a wonderful offer, and I can imagine most people would want to take advantage of that and follow up with you. And we at Institute of OD, right, also appreciate everyone attending today, and hopefully that this was of value to you. I think it was really excellent and a timely topic for leadership development, those of us in leadership development. So if you see the control panel on the side, you might have to click it open. There's a little arrow with on top of an orange rectangular. Click that open and write your questions in. At least say hi to Mary and let her know how much you enjoyed the webinar and if it was of value to you. But if you certainly have any questions, please.
What I'd like to do, if someone is going to ask a question, I hope they do, but I will mention that one of the interesting things in a team setting is to be able to see what mindset each one of the team members are. Sometimes it could be, if everybody's in the same mindset, it could be good because you can make decisions fast, but it could also be bad because you could run into groupthink. So one of the ways we do use the leadership spectrum profile is to look at building a team and making sure that they aren't all gravitating toward one perspective and having overlooked information. And also what we find sometimes when teams are divided, that there's an individual who has a different view and people tend to discount that person. And what the mindsets does is help people understand how every one of these mindsets brings value to the table. So again, there's some wonderful ways that the mindset approach can be used to make sure that we are more effective together.
Let me see if we have any questions. We have a lot of people that have said wonderful webinar. We really appreciate it, Mary, and appreciate getting acquainted with you. One would be, how many leaders do you think that we should have in a group? Can you tell us a little bit more about that? What would be your approach? Would you start at the top? Go ahead.
It would depend on what the group is in charge of doing. I think that when there's a group that's in charge with handling an emergency, it's better to have one leader in charge. I think that when a group is coming up with a creative new idea, I think it's better to have everyone in charge. I do think that we need to be more specific about when we look at teams, because we have, what I call the salute and execute team, but we also have the self-managed team. So we're using the word team without any context. What is their task? How are they structured? How much autonomy do they have? What are their roles and responsibilities? So I'm not sure that one answer fits, every situation. But obviously, if I'm firefighting in Alberta, I want one person in charge and getting those things done. But if I'm trying to come up with a new way to purify water, I want everyone to contribute. And so I think we structure things differently given the task.
Mary, another question, what happens after we would introduce the assessment to leaders? What do you recommend that we do next in order to start working on the mindsets?
What I would like you to do is to take the checklist of questions that comes with the leadership spectrum profile and ask the team to tailor it to their situation, so they can use it as their checklist when they're dealing with a challenging or complex decision. So I want the leadership spectrum to introduce the concept of mindsets, so it will introduce the checklist. And so leaders can use that checklist for making smarter decisions when, again, it's not a routine decision. So again, to me, the goal is to be able to share a tool. And at the same time, that tool is going to say, let's value the diversity of the different perspectives. And at the same time, I will also say it does a marvelous job of reducing the amount of conflict on a team. The American Management Association did a study many years ago saying 20% of any leader's time at any point, any position in the organization is spent on conflict. And what happens is that conflict comes from the fact that when we disagree with somebody, the only way we look at them is as a person. So if you disagree with me, Nancy, I would say, okay, what's her agenda? What's her motive? Or something like that. But with a mindset, we could say, why is she seeing that? And I can ask you, why do you think that's the most important thing? And we can collect information. We could actually have a discussion that's objective rather than getting into the subjective factors around conflict. So I think it has a lot of value in a variety of areas to help people work better together. Value everyone's contribution, reduce the amount of conflict, make sure you don't get surprised by overlooking some risk or some consequence that you hadn't anticipated, and make sure that you don't fall for a faulty assumption. I mean, the faulty assumption that I like to think about is in the late 1990s, bankers thought you could give 95% mortgages based on the assumption that home prices never go down 5%. Nobody questioned that, and they paid a price. So I think that it has quite a few applications to help people work better together.
Thank you so much, Mary. It's almost 1 o'clock, and I know people need to get back to doing whatever they need to do, and we want to thank you so much, and we really appreciate the time we spent with you today.
It was wonderful to be with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mary. Bye, everyone. Please feel free to reach out to us and any questions that you might have, and we'll follow up with you. Take care.